Ethan Parker had never heard of Black Hollow before the letter arrived. The envelope was thick, aged, with his name scrawled across it in elegant but unfamiliar handwriting. The paper inside was crisp but carried an odd, metallic scent, as though it had been sealed away for decades. It bore a formal but unsettling message: his uncle, Arthur Parker, had passed away, leaving him his estate. He didn't recall having an Uncle Arthur. His parents had never mentioned him. Yet, curiosity outweighed hesitation. The drive to Black Hollow was long, winding through dense forests and mist-laden roads where the trees seemed to lean inward, as if whispering secrets. His GPS failed miles before the town, leaving him to rely on an old map he had printed before leaving. As he entered Black Hollow, the first thing he noticed was the silence. No cars, no people, just the faint rustle of leaves in the wind, which carried an eerie, almost melodic quality. The town's main street was lined with old-fashioned buildings with peeling paint and darkened windows. A single, flickering streetlight buzzed overhead. According to the letter, a lawyer was supposed to meet him at the town's inn, but when he arrived, the lobby was empty. The innkeeper, a wiry old man with sunken eyes, barely spoke when Ethan checked in, handing him a heavy brass key before disappearing behind a curtain. Ethan felt the weight of unseen eyes on his back as he climbed the creaking stairs to his room. That night, as he lay in bed, the wind picked up. It howled through the trees outside, but beneath it, he could have sworn he heard something else: whispers, soft and insidious, threading through the night like fingers through silk. Sleep did not come easily. Ethan awoke to an overcast morning, the sky heavy with unfallen rain. After a breakfast of cold toast and bitter coffee at the inn, he set out to find the manor. The road leading up to Hollow Hill was cracked and uneven, flanked by dead trees whose skeletal branches clawed at the sky. Fog clung to the ground, swirling around his feet as he walked. When the house finally came into view, his breath caught. The manor was a monstrous thing, 3 stories of dark, rotting wood, its once grand columns now warped and cracked. The windows, tall and narrow, looked like hollowed-out eyes watching him approach. The front doors loomed ahead, slightly ajar, swaying with the wind's breath. Inside, the air was thick with dust, carrying the scent of old books and something more pungent: mildew, or perhaps decay. The grand foyer opened into a hallway lined with portraits, their subjects' expressions stern, their eyes following him. He felt an inexplicable unease as he stepped deeper into the house, as if he were trespassing where he did not belong. The study was the only room untouched by time. Papers lay scattered across the desk as if someone had left in a hurry. On the far side of the room, an old leather-bound diary sat open. The last entry was written in bold, frantic strokes. Never listen to the whispers after midnight. That night, as he lay in his new bedroom, he understood why. The voices started as a murmur, like the rustling of leaves. Then they grew, winding through the walls, calling his name in a chorus of voices, some pleading, some mocking, some barely more than sighs. The diary had warned him. But he had nowhere to go. At exactly midnight, the air in the room changed. The temperature dropped, and the voices grew clearer. They weren't coming from outside, as he had first assumed. They were seeping through the very walls of the manor, curling into his ears like breath against his skin. Ethan. He bolted upright, heart hammering. The whisper had been right beside him. Throwing the covers aside, he grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight, scanning the room. Nothing. No one. But the whispering didn't stop. It slithered through the air, shifting from one corner to another, always just beyond his line of sight. He stepped toward the door, gripping the handle with clammy fingers, and yanked it open. The hallway stretched before him, long and dark, with the portraits watching in silent judgment. Downstairs, the front door loomed like a beacon. He needed to leave. Now. The moment his foot hit the first stair, a loud creak echoed through the empty house. The whispering ceased. Silence pressed in on him like a weight. And then. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Coming from upstairs. He wasn't alone. Ethan barely slept that night. Every creak of the old house, every whisper of wind against the window sent a shiver down his spine. The town was wrong. Rotten at its core. And now, he was part of it. Morning came sluggishly, sunlight breaking through the fog like a dull knife through flesh. He found himself staring out the window at the street below. Something had changed. The air felt heavier, charged with an unseen force. Then he saw them. A line of townsfolk, moving in eerie synchronization, walking up the road toward the church. There was no chatter, no murmuring, only the rhythmic shuffle of their feet against the cracked pavement. Their heads were bowed, their arms limp at their sides. Like puppets. Ethan grabbed his phone, but there was no signal. His heart pounded as he pulled on his jacket and stepped outside. He needed to know where they were going. He followed at a distance, his breath fogging in the crisp morning air. As the crowd neared the church, its wooden doors swung open without anyone touching them. The congregation filed in without hesitation, disappearing into the darkness beyond. Ethan hesitated. But then, he heard it. A whisper. Soft, insidious, curling through the cold morning air like a snake around his neck. "You're late." His stomach clenched. The voice had no source, no direction, it was everywhere and nowhere. A chill ran down his spine as he forced himself to step forward, blending into the tail end of the procession. Inside, the church was dimly lit by candlelight. The pews were packed, yet no one spoke. At the front, beneath the looming figure of a withered crucifix, stood a man Ethan hadn't seen before. He was tall, gaunt, draped in a priest's robe that seemed far too old to belong to this century. His eyes were black pits, empty of light. "Welcome," the priest said, his voice soft, almost reverent. "We are gathered, as always, to listen." The congregation shivered as one. Ethan's throat went dry. Listen to what? Then he heard it. A sound so quiet, so distant, it could have been mistaken for the wind. But it wasn't the wind. It was whispering. And it was coming from beneath the church. Ethan's entire body screamed at him to run, but his legs stayed locked in place. The whispering swirled around him, rising and falling in unnatural waves. He forced himself to scan the congregation. No one else reacted. No shifting in seats, no flickering glances, just silent reverence. The priest raised his hands, and the room grew impossibly still. "Tonight, we are blessed with a visitor." Ethan's stomach dropped. The priest's black eyes settled on him. Every head in the church turned in unison. Ethan gripped the pew in front of him, his knuckles white. The whispering beneath the floorboards grew louder, closer, slithering into his ears like oil. The wood beneath his feet felt thinner now, hollow, as if something was moving just below the surface. The priest smiled. "Come forward." Ethan's breath hitched. No. He wasn't going to play into this. He turned on his heel, ready to bolt. The doors slammed shut behind him. A wave of whispers crashed against his skull, burrowing into his mind, pouring in through his ears, his pores, his breath. He staggered, the world tilting. "Come forward." The congregation waited, unmoving. The priest's arms remained outstretched, expectant. The whispering had reached a fever pitch, forming words now, voices overlapping in a cacophony of dread. "He sees you. He knows your name. Let him in." Ethan's body felt detached from his mind, his vision blurring at the edges. Something inside him was shifting, stretching toward the sound. He clenched his teeth, fighting against whatever force was sinking its claws into him. And then, the floor split open. Wooden planks groaned as something enormous pushed upward from beneath. A hand. No, not a hand. Something darker, boneless, shifting like smoke but solid enough to splinter the floor. It reached for him. Ethan didn't think. He ran. He barreled past the pews, shoving through the unmoving congregation, their heads twisting too slowly to follow him. The doors wouldn't budge. He pounded against them, his heart slamming against his ribs. Behind him, the whispering had become a roar. And then, silence. Ethan turned, his breath ragged. The priest was staring at him, his smile widening. He will not be ignored. The church lights flickered. The air warped. And then, Ethan was no longer standing in the church. He was somewhere else. Somewhere very, very dark. The church was gone. Ethan stood in a void. The floor beneath him was cold stone, slick with something wet. The air was thick, damp, and smelled of rot. He took a step forward, and the sound echoed endlessly. Hello. No response. Only the distant, rhythmic dripping of water. Panic clawed at his chest. He turned in circles, but there were no walls, no ceiling, only a vast, endless blackness stretching in all directions. He fumbled for his phone. The screen wouldn't turn on. A whisper slid past his ear. Not words this time. Just breath. Cold and close. Ethan whirled around, his pulse hammering. Still nothing. Then, beneath him, the stone shifted. A low, guttural sound rumbled from deep below, like something massive exhaling after a long slumber. A slow, scraping noise followed, something sharpening, or something crawling. Ethan ran. His footsteps were swallowed by the blackness, but the sound behind him grew. The scraping became a slithering, an uneven shuffle like too many limbs moving at once. A shape loomed ahead. A door. Old and wooden, covered in strange carvings. Ethan threw himself against it, his fingers scrambling for a handle. The slithering was closer now. Something wet brushed the back of his ankle. He yanked the door open and fell through, slamming it shut behind him. Silence. Ethan was back in the church. The congregation was gone. The candles had melted into blackened stubs. The air was thick with dust, untouched for decades. Had he imagined it? A creak sounded behind him. Ethan turned. The priest was still there. Smiling. But his eyes were no longer black. They were hollow sockets. And they were still watching him. The priest's empty sockets fixed on Ethan, yet somehow, he still felt watched. A thick silence hung in the air, suffocating, as if the church itself was holding its breath. Ethan staggered back, his pulse pounding. His body screamed at him to run, but something held him there, an invisible weight pressing down on his chest. The priest took a step forward. His movements were wrong, like a marionette with its strings tangled. You should not have left. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps. Stay back. The priest didn't stop. His lips moved, but his voice came from everywhere at once. He is waiting. A sudden gust of wind howled through the church, rattling the wooden beams. The candles flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Ethan turned, searching for an escape, but every door was gone. The windows had vanished. The church was sealing itself shut. The whispering returned. Louder this time. Hissing from the cracks in the walls, seeping up from the floorboards. It slithered around him, wrapping tight like a second skin. Let him in. The priest's mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. And then, his skin began to split. Thin cracks spread across his face, widening as dark liquid oozed from beneath. His flesh peeled away in jagged strips, revealing something writhing underneath. Not muscle. Not bone. Something older. Hungrier. Ethan stumbled back, his stomach lurching. The priest's body collapsed inward, folding like paper, his form unraveling into a swirling mass of shadows and tendrils. It surged toward Ethan, the whispering rising to a deafening chorus. And then the floor dropped out from under him. He was falling. Spinning. Plummeting into darkness. And just before the black swallowed him whole, he heard laughter. Deep. Echoing. Welcoming. Ethan's body slammed against something hard. His vision swam, pain flaring through his ribs. He gasped, struggling to push himself up. Where was he? The church was gone. Instead, he was in a cavernous space, stretching endlessly in all directions. The walls pulsed, shifting as if alive, their surfaces slick and glistening in the dim light. Shapes moved within them, twisting, writhing, whispering. Not walls. Skin. The realization made his stomach turn. He staggered forward, his shoes squelching against the damp floor. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of decay. A shuffling sound echoed in the distance. Ethan froze. Something was moving toward him. Slow. Deliberate. He turned, his eyes straining in the gloom. A figure emerged from the shifting darkness. It was human, or at least, it had been. Its face was stretched too thin, skin pulled taut over jagged bone. Its mouth gaped open, whispering ceaselessly, though its lips did not move. Its hands twitched at its sides, fingers curling and uncurling in erratic spasms. Behind it, more figures stirred. Dozens. Hundreds. All whispering. Ethan took a step back, his heart hammering. The figures moved in unison. A tide of murmuring bodies, creeping closer, their empty eyes fixed on him. He turned and ran. The ground shifted beneath him, softening like flesh, trying to pull him down. The whispers surged, overlapping, filling his head until it felt like his skull would split open. He is waiting. You cannot leave. Join us. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps. His vision blurred, the walls closing in. Then. A door. Massive. Old. Embedded in the pulsing wall of flesh. Ethan lunged for it, fingers grasping at the iron handle. The whispering figures shrieked. A sound of pure agony, of hunger. The door swung open. And the world lurched. Ethan stumbled forward, the door slamming shut behind him. The whispers cut off, leaving only a ringing silence. He was in another chamber. Smaller. Circular. At its center, a pit yawned open, impossibly black. A chasm that felt alive. And something was moving within it. Slow. Breathing. Ethan's knees buckled. A shadow began to rise from the pit. Massive. Formless. A void given shape. The whispers returned. But now, they came from inside him. His own voice joined the chorus, speaking words he did not understand. Let me in. The shadow loomed over him, tendrils unfurling like broken fingers. A pressure filled the air, suffocating, ancient. Ethan realized, with bone-deep terror. It was not speaking to him. It was speaking through him. Something was inside his head. Crawling. Digging. His vision blurred. His thoughts were not his own. The shadow leaned closer, its presence seeping into every inch of his skin. And then. A sound. Distant. Familiar. A bell. Loud. Ringing through the void like a beacon. The shadow recoiled, its tendrils snapping back. The whispers faltered. The ground trembled beneath Ethan's feet. And suddenly. He was falling. Again. But this time, he wasn't alone. The shadow was coming with him. Ethan awoke on the floor of the church. The congregation was gone. The air was stale, untouched. The candles had long burned out. Had it all been a nightmare? He staggered to his feet, his entire body aching. His hands trembled as he reached for the door. This time, it opened. The town was silent. Empty. Not a single soul in sight. He stepped into the street, his breath visible in the cold air. The buildings looked wrong. Faded. Ancient, as if they had stood for centuries without change. Something in his gut twisted. Slowly, he turned back toward the church. The wooden sign above the entrance had changed. The name of the town was different now. A name he did not recognize. A name that had not been there before. A whisper drifted past his ear. Soft. Familiar. Welcome home. Ethan turned. And the town swallowed him whole.